Well, hi there, and welcome to this special episode of NetSupport Radio. Really pleased to have a guest today on the show, Kevin Hogan. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Al, thanks very much. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, sir. Now, today we're going to be talking a bit about US and UK schools, what we can learn from each other, chew the fat on that topic. And I can't think of a better person to give that kind of perspective of the broader landscape than your good self. I was going to introduce you, Kevin, and just share the breadth of all the different titles and publications that you've been involved in editorially, but gave up when I saw the list. So perhaps you could provide some salient highlights for those listening in today.
Yeah, well, just at the expense of dating myself, I've always written about the intersection of business and technology. So some of my first bylines had titles such as, will email work in corporate America for Forbes magazine back in 1993. So obviously we answered that question. Yes, it did. And, since that point, I've just kind of been following this amazing transformation of our planet through the use of technology. Specifically education, I started in 2003 with Scholastic Administrator magazine, where I was executive editor, and then moved over to Tech and Learning, where I had been for the past 12 years, where I was first introduced to NetSupport and the great work that you folks do, and that actually gave me the opportunity for my first bet, which was back in 2008. And this year's is the first one not happening. Another addition to my list of existential crises. But so just really, it's just been focused on watching how technology has influenced generations now of not only professionals but also students. So that's kind of where I sit.
Well, you've had a fantastic kind of spread there in terms of having an opportunity to see how things have evolved and changed. And I suppose in many ways right now we're at quite a good juncture where for the wrong reasons, COVID has encouraged us all to pause and reflect a little bit on where we've been, what we actually want to achieve if we move forward. And it's a good catalyst. So probably this is a good point to kick off our chat with a bit of a helicopter view. So, I was looking at and trying to make a few kind of points of the key things to discuss with you, and I suppose the starting one is, where are we at right now? So in terms of kind of a learning environment from a US perspective, where are school districts sitting at the moment? Where does that kind of remote hybrid blended model sit in terms of everyone's focus?
Yeah, well, the one thing with the states, which is both exhilarating but also extremely frustrating, are the number of school districts that we're talking about, right? So 15,000 different school districts. The largest, New York City, has over 1 million students in a single district, which is larger than many countries' entire ecosystem when it comes to education. Yeah. And then 15 miles away, and then where I sit in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey itself has over 200 school districts, some as small as 300, 400 students. So when you look at the education landscape, it just goes the full spectrum, right? But so right now, from my conversations with school district leaders, we have every particular different flavor you could think of. There are some schools that have been entirely remote from pretty much this time last year. Friday the 13th last year seems to be that kind of D-Day event. There are any number of different varieties of hybrid and virtual that have been set up. Some districts have set up just a fully virtual academy style, where they surveyed the parents. They said, what would you prefer? Would you prefer your kids in school or prefer them to be at home, depending on your home situation? Then they're be fully remote with a separate curricula, with a separate faculty. And then people are either all or nothing. And then there's also a variety. My boys are in a hybrid setup where they go in Thursdays and Fridays. The other group goes in Mondays and Tuesdays, and then Wednesdays is asynchronous Wednesday, where they're kind of left to their own devices, which I actually kind of like. It's kind of a good college prep. They're in high school, and they're kind of given their projects to go. And if they need to speak to a teacher, they can buzz them through any sort of social media or even texting. So I guess that's a long answer to the short answer of it depends. So
Yeah.
there's really everything happening. How about with the UK? Is it something more standardized?
Yeah, well, I suppose the UK, I would always argue when I was looking at the landscape, and you talk back to March last year, the first model that really shaped, actually, I saw was in the Middle East, and particularly in the UAE, where there's a high density of international schools which have perhaps the better density of technology, and they were quickest to formulate a strategy. The UK, after the initial shock, shall we say, of we're going to be closing down schools, there was an initial kind of teachers scrambled to look for different online solutions where they could deliver some kind of engagement and curriculum enrichment, I guess. And then the second phase was where we started to standardize more on, if you're an Office 365 or a Google school, you've got a certain platform, and there's a number of challenges. I think where sometimes there's been a miss, and it's understandable, is it's been quite prescriptive in the sense of our expectation is for a certain age group of children, they should be online for X hours a day in terms of remote learning. And the term remote learning is a bit of a woolly one, because there's remote teaching, but that doesn't necessarily deliver remote learning. But also, every cohort, every class of children is quite different in terms of their needs. And certainly when we think of the special needs children, I think there was a gap there. So it was patchy, I think, is the best answer. Some schools embraced it quite quickly. And interesting feedback from a teacher perspective was the ones that tried to be too prescriptive were less successful, because actually the bit we always forget, and maybe we'll come on to talk about that in a broader sense, is every teacher's different in terms of their skill set as well, aren't they? So Absolutely. It kind of flew back. So from that point of view, yeah, there was a kind of national guidance, but I think it really didn't materialize in the broader sense. But I suppose one of the challenges, which is interesting, because I was reading an article that you shared with about technology and broadband and infrastructure and other bits and pieces, and that was one of our biggest barriers over here, was that digital divide and that infrastructure. So I'm kind of interested from your perspective about how infrastructure played a part in terms of either enabling or inhibiting delivering remote learning.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the biggest reality checks that has occurred as a result of the pandemic is that of digital equity and equal access to not only devices. I think we used to focus on devices a lot, but especially towards bandwidth and broadband and getting it. And I kind of define things now as DP, and AP, right? So BP before the pandemic, I would go to bed and I would sit in a panel and we would talk about digital equity in a conceptual sense, right? In a theoretical sense. And these are these challenges, and we would look at, pie charts about the percentage of students who don't have as good access, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel real. And also just here back in the States, you would talk about it, but if you weren't experiencing it, you didn't really kind of have it firsthand. Last March, speaking with tech directors of school districts who went from talking about the theoretical problems that they have with digital equity to getting into their cars with Wi-Fi hotspots and driving hotspots to students in their districts who don't have access, right? And then public housing, where an entire building of students don't have access and they're sharing one device. So those sort of conceptual things became very, very real very, very quickly. And I will say, to the credit of both the education side as well as the industry side, there was a response. I mean, there was a true response where when you saw the big tech, Google released any sort of fees that they would have for access, a lot of the telcos here in the States flipped a switch and said, let's get everybody connected. Now, how long they did that for is a different question. And how long they will continue to do that is a different question. But I do think now that we're during the pandemic and starting to thankfully look to after the pandemic, we had really big news here in the States this weekend where the FCC has put out a directive that low-income students will have a $50 subsidy for their internet access. And if you're actually Native American on Native American lands, you get $75. And you would say that a basic internet connect in the U.S. is $70. So basically, the feds have come out and said, look, we're going to pay for everybody's internet access if you have a student for school. So all of a sudden, these theoretical problems were, I wouldn't say completely solved, but at least there are some answers that are being put together where people are saying, oh, why didn't we do that in the first place?
It's interesting. I mean, the challenges were very similar over here, and again, particularly for city-based schools, there's a greater inequality in terms of digital resources. And one thing that wasn't factored was the fact that you've got potentially the multiple children in a single household, and with parents at home, there was extra pressure on access to any technology that was there, and that really kind of moved the discussion on quite quickly to when we mean online learning, does it all have to be synchronous or can it be asynchronous? And if we record content and exemplars, can they be accessed at different times of the day? And perish the thought, there was also a good conversation about not all resources for teaching during the day need to be digital. There are paper resources, that old school concept, and books and other things that can help. I was just interested, given your experience, it's a question that's been asked. We talk about the challenge in terms of infrastructure, and you talked about broadband, and we were trying to mitigate with 4G dongles and other things. But is that part of the problem, the fact that so much that used to be local and desktop-based resources is now cloud-based? Has the infrastructure created a greater weakness and dependency, do you think?
I think so. I think especially when you look at the devices that we're talking about too. If you have a cloud platform that is accessed only by a Google Chromebook, and if you don't have that device that's been distributed by the district, how do you get onto it, or how easy or how difficult it is to get onto it? One interesting thing here in the States, and I will assume it happened in the UK too, when you find that lower income parents do most of their work and interaction using their phone. So even while they might not have multiple devices, a smartphone is pretty much standard operating procedure. So if you have a cloud platform that works on mobile, then that's fine. But if you can't check your kid's homework through your phone, you're not checking your kid's homework, right? Or you're not as deeply involved as it is with the platform. So I would agree definitely that the platforms need to be more dispersed to work, especially in a mobile setup. It's
a funny sort of dichotomy, because in one sense we want to share rich and visual resources for our children, but actually we also at times need it to be very optimized to be lightweight. We found for a lot of families in the UK, losing work or going onto furlough and a reduction in their income, that one of the first things that went were the mobile data plans, the excess data charges. And so actually trying to access, and you're right, mobile was the lowest common denominator that we could get all of the families pretty certain they'd have a device of some type in the household.
Yeah.
The data cost, because we were sharing these really rich platforms, we wind the clock back 15 years ago and things weren't quite so data heavy. I mean, they weren't so engaging or so amazing in other regards, but it's that kind of challenge of has the tech and the content almost been one of the key foundations for causing that digital inequality. And
well, and here in the States as well, when you have the telcos and you look at cable and cable television, and those sort of platforms, which are mimicking a cloud platform, I've always kind of beat the drum that, many low to medium income families do have cable because it is kind of an essential service to a large degree. Why not have your platform operate through that? I mean, I sit in front of my smart TV and I can download the Netflix app. Why can't I download my school district ABC app and look at my kids' stuff on there as much as I could on a desktop or on a phone, right? So those are some of the distributed complexities that occur here that hopefully, when you look at the history of something like E-rate, that the states have been able to get it together. They have been able to create a basic infrastructure. And with proper leadership and coordination with private industry, I'm hopeful that it can move forward.
Yeah, I mean, we all have to keep our fingers crossed. Again, it comes back to that earlier point of we've created the catalyst for the conversation, and at least we're now looking and thinking about ways to mitigate. I was thinking in a broader picture, from your position and your exposure, where do you see some of the other challenges that the schools are facing at the moment? Is it curriculum related, funding related, training related? Where would you see the main pinch points that have come to the fore?
Well, I know just during the heat of the crisis this past year, one of the biggest challenges is another kind of conceptual, theoretical phrase, social emotional learning. Something that you would hear a lot. And I kind of say, I would nod my head and say, oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about, and wouldn't know what you're talking about. I know very well what it means now. It's connecting with your students, giving them a sense of safety, whether they're in school or they're out of school. And this remote setup has really switched that around a lot, where people are understanding the home lives of a lot of their students were not as great as maybe they hadn't even thought about before. So social emotional learning, I think, has really gone to the top of the list for the districts that I've spoken to, about just making sure there's a baseline. Because if you don't have that baseline of emotional safety or comfort, you're not going to learn. It doesn't matter what your curriculum is, right? So that's certainly, I would say, at the top of the list. Is that something that I assume that's a universal situation, right?
I think we all recognise that that's one of the key areas. I mean, when we talk about children coming back to school, and that immediately there's that message of catch up and personalised learning to kind of fill the gap. Actually, most in the profession would start and say, no, actually the first few months is about getting young people back into a safe space, addressing the challenges that are being created by them being in the situation away from their friends for the last year, reteaching them how to learn, getting back into that mindset of how to do things. And we've seen a huge amount, again, different by age group naturally, but a lot of our vulnerable learners have had a much harder experience because they haven't had that support framework at home. Again, it's where the quick and rapid introduction of whether you're a Teams or you're a Google or you're a Zoomer or whatever platform you choose to use. In many ways, it was those most vulnerable children or our children with developmental needs where change is a challenge, to be able to provide that familiarity and the face on the screen every day and have some kind of narrative has been really, really important. So I think everyone recognised that trumps learning. That's the priority right now, is to get that aspect addressed. And I think you've got to be a brave man or woman to predict how long that's going to take, because I think it's far more deep-seated, and we'll discover more impact as time goes on. I think outside of that, the natural one, I suppose, was about teacher training, CPD. That's the thing that's kind of come to the fore. I think the education profession, much as we go through a cycle, or we certainly have here, between being very supportive and being quite negative toward teachers, the mindset, I think, for some parents, once they've experienced homeschooling, is that it's the teachers that have decided not to allow the children back rather than anything more governmental or federal,
Yep.
But what we have seen is that element of, we got to that March point last year, and much of that focus was about, embrace these tools. And teachers have to adapt really, really quick. And I think it set a narrative, a topic I talk a lot about, is about the effective use of technology and so on. And often you hear the narrative about how much do we need for technology, how much do we need for software, and CPD doesn't really factor. And I think it's reshaped that about actually the schools that have managed to mitigate the best. And I'm the first to say, much as I love my EdTech and I like to promote the impact it can have in supporting good teaching and learning, it's no substitute. Remote learning doesn't replace 100% the experience of a teacher and children in a classroom and that engagement and enrichment. But where the success has come has absolutely been in that teacher confidence, and I often share I love Sylvia Duckworth's kind of design graphics that she does, that teacher confidence curve, from survival mode, which I think we could all empathize on. I mean, I've done sessions in schools where I've walked in, and because it's not my device with my stuff on, your confidence level's pretty low when you've got that audience in front of you and you've got to hope everything's going to work. Yeah. Through to that point of what we're all trying to do is be innovative. And so I suppose part of that's been about encouraging schools to be able to support teachers in taking risks, try different things.
Yeah, I mean, the key word that you said there is empathy, right? So, I mean, we talk about the emotional support for students. Another dramatic change, I think, as a result of all this madness is an empathy for teachers. As a parent, I certainly have a new appreciation for those folks who have been taking care of my kids for the past 15 years, and an understanding of that, and actually an empathy for parents as well. I mean, I've seen from the industry side, I've written about, the education space specifically for 15 years. The number of stories I wrote that involved parents as part of an equation for an education solution, maybe, the fingers on two hands. I mean, after all those years, now all of a sudden, every parent has become a teaching assistant, right? So they're part of that equation, and they're traumatized as well. I mean, we've all been traumatized to one degree or another here, and so to have that understanding and to put that forth in the professional or parental development, however, whatever phrase that you want to use, I think is going to be ultimately a net positive, and it's not something that's going to go back to the way it was before. I think because of this group experience, we're now going to take that lesson and move it forward.
And you hit a real sweet spot for me there, because I wanted to talk a bit more about the landscape of CPD and how it sits within the US perspective. But one of the really key strands that's resonated recently has been actually about what have schools done in terms of parental CPD, not necessarily the broader education landscape, but facilitating their confidence to use the right tools to communicate back to school. And if we think about our younger learners, we have much more dependency on the parents to be the overseer of activity and capturing evidence. I'm interested from your perspective about whether enough focus has been put on how we kind of bring parents into the mix.
Well, I think it happens whether anybody wanted it to or not, right? I mean, this was the biggest forced beta test in history. There was no choice on whether you were going to Zoom or not, unless if you're going to participate, you're in it, you're going to learn it. My parents learned it. They don't like it. Too bad. And the same with schools, right? So, but as people adjusted, I think they've begun to see some of the benefits of it. And in certain ways, some district leaders I've talked to almost have a certain guilty pleasure, because when you look at specifically asynchronous or having a communication like we're having right now versus sending a school note home and calling someone through the main office to talk to a teacher, this is much more effective. It's much more productive. As a parent, I think about, I've had guidance counselor chats this way, much more productive than if I'm sitting in a desk in a third grade classroom with 25 other parents at back to school night. I mean, the back to school there's a strange intimacy to this that I think benefits a lot of one-to-one. You talked about, students, vulnerable students, we talk about students here with their IEP reports, where you need to have 8 people in a room at once to discuss whether a student is going to be in special education or not. And it can be a very delicate conversation. There could be power struggles and power dynamics that are involved there. And this is according to folks in the profession. I mean, these are special ed directors and parents and teachers. This actually is kind of an egalitarian way in which to communicate in that space. So in a strange way, we have beta tested this to find the best uses of it, which actually is better than being in person. And that's not saying that if we go back to regular classroom instruction, and as you pointed out, there is no replacement to that dynamic. It can be enhanced, but it can't be replaced. I won't mind seeing the back to school night be replaced with a Zoom call myself, and then we'll go out and we'll have a social with the faculty afterwards, where we don't have to go through that that laundry list of requirements and everything that can happen this way.
I mean, it's interesting. Some of the lessons we have learned that tie into that. I mean, things like we have, our parents' evenings once a term. We found doing them online, we've actually managed to really engage with what we would refer to as hard to reach families, those families that don't typically come into the school building and engage with the teachers. And so actually technology has made certain aspects, very small aspects of Black parental engagement more accessible. Back to your point, if you deliver easy to consume information and engagement direct to the smartphone, you remove some of the barriers than the letters in the post or the requiring you to sign into a system and do something more sophisticated. And that's been a real leveler.
Yeah.
Coming back to the CPD point, I'm sure it's a compliment. I think many of us in the UK look at the US and see you having a more effective level of confidence of technology and being interwoven into school life. Whether that's justified or not, I'm interested from your perception. Do you think that's the case, or do you think what we're talking about here really seems to be consistent both sides of the pond?
I think you may be giving us more credit where credit is due. There's obviously a certain population, and from where I sit, I always think that I always found myself in a biased place, because people who are reading Tech and Learning magazine or kind of like going to BET or to ISTE, they've already drank the Kool-Aid, right? I mean, they understand the benefits of that. And then you fail to recognize that there's this wider population of folks who don't, who laminate their chemistry chalkboard because this is the way I've taught chemistry for 20 years, and why do I need this tablet to help me do what I've done so effectively before, right? We used to call them the thwatties. That's the way I've always done it, was the acronym. Again, everyone was thrown into the pool. You couldn't use your laminated chalkboard last spring. So if you wanted to be effective, if you wanted to help your students, you went in. And to give even those educators credit, I mean, everybody jumped in. And everybody gave it their best shot anyway. And I think for the most part, it was effective as it could be. Going forward, whatever the new normal is, AP after the pandemic, I think you may see a lot of people try to revert to the way they've always done it before, but maybe they'll hold on to things like we were just discussing, where they'll have a quick Zoom call with a parent instead of sending back a note. I mean, I think there will be some behaviors that will be retained even amongst folks who maybe aren't the most technically inclined.
It's interesting you say that, and I share those views. I mean, I certainly hope some of the things that have worked well become embedded and we don't simply drift back, because I had the conversation in one of the multi-academy trusts that I lead here. It was questions like, during the Easter holidays, our staff come in and do revision classes for all our exam students. Why aren't we doing that from home? Thinking about their work-life balance and well-being. There's lots of these things where teachers are giving up their time, but they could be potentially they could do that much more effectively. And at the same time, one of the key ones was, you can start recording these exemplars, which actually provides collateral for other teachers. It's good sharing of resources, which helps with well-being. And it engages for our children that are off sick or don't attend. You start to build that resource library that you could never really do quite the same in the physical space, I guess. So I really do hope we learn some lessons. I think that the challenge with being embedded, and slightly going off on a tangent, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. Lots of teachers, for the right reasons, have been looking at, I've got a problem, let me find a solution, or something that does what I need within the classroom. And there's this kind of two mindsets when it comes to EdTech looking forwards. So one is, do you go out looking for a solution to do the task that you want? And the other is, or do you go out and see what's available and take a view that you're willing to adapt the way that you do something in the classroom to leverage the benefits of the technology? Because I have this kind of challenge, I suppose, which is, if we're always ever just looking for what we know, we don't necessarily broaden the horizon. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that comes also down to a time situation for educators, right? I mean, so here in the States, you are delivered a curriculum that you're supposed to provide to those students during the fall. So 6th grade science, right? And here's Pearson has given you the curriculum. Here's some examples of things that you can do and have at it. Some of the more innovative teachers will go out and they'll go to nasa.com and complement those basic bits of curriculum with some really interesting stuff. To have that initiative to go out and get it, you can't rely on every educator to do that. But again, having been forced to be home and sit in front of their screens and maybe discover some of those things that are out there and online, I think maybe more folks would be inclined to do that. I would hope so anyway, as I desperately try to find the glass half full.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that very much comes across. I think the one thing that also kind of resonates is we have this kind of conversations and we're talking about what we've learned and the pros and the things we can embed. And most of this comes back to saying, and the teachers could and the teachers should, but actually there's got to be a bigger conversation. If we're thinking about, I'd like to wrap it up as a digital strategy, where we want to be in 5-10 years from now. It shouldn't be just the teachers expected to find the time and capacity. It needs to be absolutely teaching and learning centric, but it also needs to be facilitated by senior leadership, the IT teams, from a data protection, from a those children with their special educational needs from a safeguarding, e-safety perspective. There's quite a few stakeholders that we kind of need to encourage to get in the virtual room and actually start thinking ahead.
Yeah, well, as well as the student. I mean, we talk about student agency. I mean, I've watched my own beta testers here go out and complement their own homework, going through and finding things on the internet and vetting whether it's accurate or not, kind of going through that whole digital literacy aspect of it. And students need to feel responsibility for their own learning paths as well. I mean, now I'm not talking about maybe kindergartners or first grade, but starting in, here in the States as middle school, I think there's a lot of student agency that has been set up as a result of this. It was the students who set up their parents on how to use Zoom at the beginning stages, right? And as they continue that, I think that's a great thing for a student to own their own learning and kind of go after their own curiosities, and then let the teachers help guide them, right? I mean, that's the whole Sugora Mitra idea, right? Is to help guide these students on the path that they're going.
Sage on the stage, guide on the side.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So and now we're watching the technology enable that. It's not changing it, but it's enabling it. So again, another silver lining, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, it's great that it is the catalyst for these kind of conversations. I'm interested in a bigger picture as we kind of conclude some of these topics, just in terms of curriculum and actually the way that learning is presented in the US versus the UK. Do you think it's appropriately dialed in, for want of a better word, to suit or be able to adapt to the current flux? And perhaps to put a little bit of a label on that, in the UK, one of the strong narratives and discussions we have is this balance, the yin and the yang between knowledge and skills, and whether the curriculum is shifting too far one way or the other. Is it just about how much we can get in there, or is it the tools to be able to do that themselves for the next 70 years?
I think from the state's perspective, it's going to be the tools, and then the ideas and the curriculum and the mindset behind it falls again to that local district. It comes down to that school board and how they want to present information, and that's a for better or for worse sort of thing. But there's definitely not going to be a set state here. In the U.S., it's certainly going to be something that will continue to be localized, I believe.
It's interesting, and I understand that. I mean, the state setup, you have so many more independent pockets, shall we say, of influence and control. I kind of hope in many ways that the move to this remote learning has provided an opportunity for more young people to learn skills. And when I see our youngest learners at home, but learning baking skills and how to support around the house and collaborating in the garden, to me, those are just valuable skills. And maybe our exam structures in the UK don't lend themselves so much to keeping that focus away from just how much knowledge can you consume and evidence in a few hours. But there's been opportunity, which is really good.
Yeah, well, assessment's a whole other kettle of fish too, right?
Yeah, we could have a whole separate conversation on that one, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
In terms of our chat today, and I found it fascinating. I just wanted to wrap up, and I'm just going to throw one kind of out there for you. If you could pick one topic as a one to watch for 21-22, and it could be a way of teaching, it could be a narrative, it could be a challenge. What's the number one thing that you would hope or expect to see kind of coming to the fore in terms of discussions in the year ahead?
There are so many, right? There are so many different things that are happening all at the same time. I'm going to go with stick with the remote hybrid versus in person and what is going to happen in September. And, let's go with the best case scenarios. We're all vaccinated, or we're enough to vaccinated where every school will be able to host the students that they hosted in 2019. The question will be, what sort of these technologies that we've all come to use in the past 18 months, that we've all passed the test to a certain degree, will remain. I think that's going to be my focus. Will be if I still had a back to school issue for September in an old fashioned print magazine,
Yeah,
it was always the big deal, right? September was back to school. That would be the cover story. That would be the, what do we look like? And again, I think it will go back to a lot of different varieties that different schools can have the opportunity to implement. Again, a net positive, really.
that resonates really well, Kevin. I mean, the one thing that I always say, sort of straddling the commercial and the education space, is the number one, virtue for me that I look at educators is the fact that as a profession, everyone's very reflective, and actually are willing to, look back and see what's worked well and what hasn't. And so now that the narrative is about how do we enable the work well to be maintained and become embedded in what we do moving forward, as long as it has impact. I'm also conscious that we talked about it earlier, the kind of the catch up and the personalized learning needed for each individual child. From a technology perspective, it starts actually, it's hearts and minds. It's not technology at all in the first few months. It's about those dynamics and that empathy that you alluded to. But I do think there's a more of a move now to looking probably aligned with teacher well-being in terms of the time pressures that are put on educators, about how tools either can save time by being just as appropriate both in the classroom and outside, so you've got the one tool to learn rather than the two, or things like the AI focus that is a great and hot topic, isn't it, at the moment, the AI focus, about how that can be used to support personalized learning, and whether that's going to be a factor in reducing teacher pressures and time learned.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And again, another one of those phrases, right? Like social emotional learning, like AI, like what does it exactly mean? Is it that is it that chat bot in the lower right-hand corner asking me, right?
I so hope not.
Right, or is it is it that robot that again is that threat that's supposed to replace a teacher? And I mean I just see it as just another way that it's an automated guide on the side.
Yeah,
to direct people in certain ways, and then.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin. I certainly hope. I think sometimes we have to start by setting out the kind of the rules of this sort of engagement and debate, which is EdTech's never going to replace human beings interacting with other human beings and teaching and learning. It's like you say, it's that facilitator that sits there, and we have an obligation, I think, looking at technology. If I wear a vendor's hat, to be kind of research informed and transparent about what solutions will do, because there's too many smoke and mirrors out there promising the amazing outcomes that perhaps aren't always evidenced. And AI
21st century learning, right?
Yeah, well, exactly.
It's 2021 now, so let's move on.
But AI is a great example of that. The number of solutions that are AI powered, they're just a set of rules, set of scripts, and I think if we want people to have confidence in tech, one thing I've been sort of saying is less is more. This isn't a race for who can use the most products in their school district. It's finding the right tools that are used effectively and well. We've also at the same time got to have confidence that those solutions that people are picking are the right ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, absolutely. So, listen, sir, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining NetSupport Radio. One thing I do want to do, I know you are a prolific writer and you're also a podcaster. For anybody who's listening in today that hasn't heard of you, and I'm sure there might be one or two people on the planet that haven't, whereabouts would people go if they wanted to check out some of your podcasts or work, Kevin? Yeah,
the quickest thing is just to go to LinkedIn and click on Kevin Hogan and EdTech Today. But then also I run the EdTech Today podcast series goes through a group called Marketscale. So that's marketscale.com. I also have a podcast series with eSchool News where I'm the editor at large there. And that's called Innovation in Education, where I'm looking at how districts are responding to the pandemic. So those are the two top places right these days.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And
thank you, Al.
I hope we can do it again.
And I hope to see you in person at BET next January.
That would be fantastic all around. I look forward to it.
Excellent.
Take care and thank you.